Welcome to zero-day and mass supply chain attacks. I am so excited to be doing this talk today because I think this is a really critical issue in which our industry is evolving and we all need to be adapting quickly. So I also had like twice as much material as could possibly fit in this presentation, so I'm going to do my best to cram it in here today. If you're wondering who's speaking to you, my name is Sherri Davidoff. I've been in the industry for 23 years. I'm the CEO of LMG Security. I've written 3 books. One of them is Data Breaches, My Labor of Love. And if you answer a trivia question today, you too could win a book. And I'm a certified penetration tester and a certified forensic analyst. This is such a critical issue in part because it seems like every day there is a new zero-day exploit out there. And the latest one that has been really rocking the world in cybersecurity is the new Cisco vulnerability. The estimates are that there are at least 40,000 Cisco devices that have actually been hacked, not just vulnerable, but that are actually hacked out there on the internet, and probably more to come. And this is just the latest in a series of huge mass zero-day attacks. We saw Kaseya. We saw recently the MoveIt attacks, which we're going to go over in a little bit. We also have cases such as SolarWinds, where a supplier gets hacked, malware is injected into their product, and that also is pushed out to their customers, 18,000 customers in that case. And then we have cloud providers like Blackbaud that get hacked, and thousands of companies, millions of people have their data exposed as a result. Now, I've rolled 2 slightly different topics together here, of course, and some of you may be wondering about that. One is mass zero-day exploits, where the vulnerability exists on the customer's system, and the hackers are exploiting that, versus the case where it's a supply chain attack. So a third-party technology vendor gets hacked, and again, malware is pushed out. So the SolarWinds style of attack. And the reason we're killing both of these birds with one stone is because a lot of the response issues are the same. And a lot of the ways that we react to those, both as vendors and as customers and third parties, are also the same. And so you'll see I've interwoven these throughout the talk, because I think we can learn some similar things. So we're going to start off by talking about the MoveIt attacks. How many of you had to handle a MoveIt breach or were somehow impacted by MoveIt? Okay, so a bunch of us. So MoveIt, of course, is secure file transfer software that had a zero-day vulnerability in it. And one of the big challenges we're facing as an industry is that hackers are targeting security-related software. In this case, they know that companies are investing in this software because they have highly sensitive data to put in there, and so that's what they're going to go after, those crown jewels. They know that if they break into that, they've got the keys to the kingdom in a lot of cases. Same thing with SolarWinds. We saw this software that had highly sensitive access, and so that was a conduit for their attack. As of today, the estimates are that up to 69.3 million individuals have had their information leaked because of the MoveIt breach. And over 2,300 organizations have reported a breach. And I can tell you that there are many organizations out there that are still in the process of analyzing this and determining whether they need to report a breach to customers, to the public, to other third parties. One of the reasons this is taking so long, the MoveIt breach, we'll go through the timeline in a second, the MoveIt breach happened in May, and we're still seeing breaches announced today because we have suppliers that are hacked and announced to their customers, who then need to do their own investigation and then announce to their customers. And so these ripple effects have gone on a long time and are likely to continue. I teach every year at the Pacific Coast Banking School, and usually before I teach, I just try to do a little survey of the landscape and get some examples of banks and credit unions that have been hacked. And that's actually really tougher than it is for me when I teach in other industries, because banks have been investing in security for a long time, and they're also very good at controlling public relations. They usually invest in attorneys, and so it's relatively rare to find examples of bank hacks in the news even after they happen. This year, it was not difficult at all. You can see the headline, 15 banks and credit unions confirm MoveIt data breaches, and there have been many, many other ones. So this is really rippling through even highly secure industries. So what exactly happened in the MoveIt attacks? First of all, it happened on Memorial Day weekend. Does anybody else have kind of like security PTSD when it comes to holidays? Every time we're coming up to the 4th of July, I'm like, oh God, I just remember Kaseya And it's hard because you're understaffed. Some of our incident response team was floating down the river, and I started getting phone calls. Thanks, Matt. Some of us were left behind. On May 27th, the Clop ransomware gang started exploiting vulnerable MoveIt systems, which was all of them because it was a zero-day vulnerability. And this was not a coincidence. They had been sitting on this vulnerability for years, and they chose when to deploy it. The way it worked was there was a SQL injection vulnerability that they leveraged to deploy web shells. And then once they got in, they stole sensitive information. They actually hacked so many systems that they didn't know exactly who they had compromised. They just told the victims to report back to them by June 14th or they were going to publish their data. This is what our Memorial Day turned into. So here's the actual posting that the Clop ransomware gang put on their dark website. So a few things to note here. Number one, they're one of the top organizations to offer penetration testing services after the fact. Nice. They're announcing this to educate companies who use Progress MoveIt that chances we download a lot of your data as part of an exceptional exploit. We are the only one who performs such attack, and relax because your data is safe. And then they say, if you had MoveIt, email our team. Call today before your company name is published here. So they don't have time to reach out and figure out the contact info for the thousands of companies that they've hacked. They just say, hey, contact us, and then if you want to work with us, maybe we can cut a deal. You can scan the internet to see how many exploitable MoveIt servers were out there. Shortly after the MoveIt attacks happened, we counted over 2,500 MoveIt servers around the world. Over 1,800 of them were based in the United States. So Shodan can be very useful, both to defenders and, of course, to attackers as well. Now, the timing of this isn't unusual, and it's something we need to prepare for. FireEye had a great study a few years ago where they found that in 76% of cases, ransomware attacks happened after hours or on the weekends, and yet we're still caught off guard a lot of the times when it's Friday afternoon, Forensics Friday, as we call it, and LMG, and all of a sudden we start to get those phone calls. When it comes to zero-day vulnerabilities, often we don't have a way to do 24/7 monitoring for them, right? Many of you probably have a SOC, are monitoring your environment for signs of compromise. Do you have somebody who's monitoring 24/7 for reports from vendors that there is a zero-day vulnerability? That is a missing piece that most of us have not yet incorporated into our incident response detection and planning. And so one of the takeaways that I'd like everyone to think about when you leave is treating a zero-day vulnerability like it's an incident, because we really need to start doing that. So monitoring threat intelligence is the first step in our checklist. Think about, where are you getting your sources of information? Are you going to hear a product that's vulnerable from the news, from Twitter? Are you subscribing to vendor alerts? If you are, again, who is watching it on a Saturday? Because often criminals are exploiting these things very quickly, and by the time you walk in the door Monday, like in the Kaseya attacks, you may already be compromised. So make sure you're setting up those threat intel sources and that they're going to be reliable. You've got a backup in case somebody's on vacation. Think of it just like you think of 24/7 detection. And you also, I want to point out that last bullet there. You want to make sure that your suppliers are doing the same. Again, when we're vetting our suppliers, ask them if they even have an inventory of what products they rely on and how they get information about vulnerabilities and things like that. Because as we'll see throughout this presentation, suppliers are really creating a lot of risk. We are going to see more zero-day exploits. It's not a coincidence that it feels like these are snowballing into an avalanche of 0 days, right? This has been coming for a long time. And for those of you that have been in the industry, you've probably been watching the news over the years. Oh, there was a source code theft here. A tech company was hacked there. I remember back when Operation Aurora occurred. Any of you guys remember Operation Aurora? When Google was hacked and Rackspace was hacked and Symantec was hacked and dozens of other technology companies were hacked. There was a lot of speculation about what did the attackers get, and that was the first time we really started to see people concerned about source code management. But what can you do if you steal a technology company's source code? You can start to comb it for vulnerabilities. It really makes that process of finding vulnerabilities and therefore creating exploits much, much faster. So source code is very valuable for hackers. If a tech company had their source code stolen 10 years ago, product source code, would they be required to disclose that? I am not a lawyer, but I have seen many, many technology companies hacked, and they were very worried about counterfeit software. They were very worried about China creating products similar to theirs. Nobody a decade ago was worried about alerting customers about the risks to their customers and the supply chain. And obviously that's evolved over the years. Now we do see more announcements, probably because there's more contractual obligations, but there's not a whole lot of legal requirements for even investigating, let alone reporting when source code gets stolen. Also, we've seen hacked bug tracking databases. One thing that really concerned me in 2017 was the article you see on the top there. Microsoft kept secret that its bug tracking database was hacked in 2013. So according to a former Microsoft employee, they had hackers break in and capture information about the bugs that they were tracking that had not yet been fixed. And you can see how valuable that would be to attackers, because again, then they can go and create exploits from that. How many of you are security researchers? You are targets. You have highly, especially those of you that research vulnerabilities or exploits, most security researchers I know are laid back and informal and don't see themselves as high priority targets. And unfortunately, hackers could break in and get sensitive information from a vendor, or they could break into a security researcher system and get information about vulnerabilities that way as well. So as a result of all of this, all these source code thefts that we see, the systemic risk has increased over the years in ways that we are not tracking and not even aware of. And we definitely need better reporting. The other piece of this that's really impacting, and by the way, if anybody wants slides, just message me on LinkedIn later. I'm happy to send you guys a copy. So the other piece of this is that there are now very mature e-commerce sites where you can buy zero-day exploits. So for those of you that use zero-day today, it's a really fascinating site where you can browse different exploits, purchase the ones that you want. And one thing that happened in the past year is they started offering some exploits. I don't know if my laser pointer works this way. Does that work? Oh, that's kind of cool. One thing that happened in the past year, they started offering exploits completely free. So that's really changed the game as well, that now there's exploits that hackers can just download, or they can choose to pay for some of the newer ones. For all these reasons, software exploits are a top attack vector. This is according to the Mandiant M-Trends report. Look at that. The #1 way that hackers are breaking in right now is through software exploits. It's like flashback to 2003, before firewalls were really ubiquitous. Also, Coalition, a major insurance company, produced a report, and they found that policyholders that have one or more unresolved critical vulnerabilities are 33% more likely to experience a claim and to report a claim. And check out the stats here. If you have an on-premise Microsoft Exchange server and you have 0 to 25 million in revenue, you have double the risk of reporting a claim like a data breach or some other cyber security claim than if you didn't run on-premise Exchange. So really interesting stats from our insurers. Of course, CISA tracks the known and exploited vulnerabilities. Notably, that just surpassed 1,000 vulnerabilities listed in the database recently. And CISA published an article about what have we learned from this, now that we've got 1,000 of them. One of the interesting findings was everything needs a CVE so that we can make sure that we're tracking on the right vulnerabilities. Simple little things like that, organizational issues, make a huge difference when it comes to remediation and reducing risk. Okay, so the second thing we need to do once we find out that a zero-day exploit has occurred or a supply chain attack has occurred is you need to figure out if you're affected. Was I affected by SolarWinds? Am I impacted by MoveIt? So step one is to understand, are you running the software? Which we want to think is easy, but how many of you think that might be harder than you want it to be? Sure, especially for mid-size and larger organizations, you may have a lot of software that maybe you didn't set up, you've got your shadow IT, and then once you know you're running that software, you have to determine if you're running an affected version. So that means you need to figure out what version you're running, and the vendor at the same time needs to figure out what versions are affected, which is a whole different ball of wax. This is an example from MoveIt. So MoveIt announced the versions that were impacted, and you can see there's a whole long list there. Every vendor reports this in a different way. It might be up on a website, it might be a table, it might be in a paragraph format. We really lack standardization right now. So again, think about who's going to be tracking this for you. The other problem is that it keeps changing. And I was talking about this with our team before, because once a vulnerability is announced, whether it's in MoveIt or Excellion or some other product, all of a sudden the eye of Sauron is upon that vendor. And typically they hire a security company to do a deep dive into that product, and they're going to find more vulnerabilities. And it should not come as a surprise to us anymore that once one zero-day vulnerability is announced, expect more vulnerabilities to be announced as well. Here you can see 3 different CVEs for MoveIt. May 31st, we had one. June 9th, another one. June 15th, another one. And so it's not a simple process where you check and say, am I affected? Is there a patch? Can I apply it? It's, am I affected? And then a few days later, you might have to check again and see if you're affected by the new thing. It's a moving target for the vendors and the customers. Things can get very complicated. This is a table that SolarWinds put out. It's color-coded to help you understand if you were impacted, what vulnerability you were impacted by, and then what you need to do. And honestly, when it gets to this point, I'm going to do my cool behind-the-screen laser. When it gets to this point where we need all that different color coding, you know it's complicated. CISA came out with cybersecurity incident and vulnerability playbooks. I think these are super helpful, and one of the things I like about it is that they actually include essentially response processes for zero-day vulnerability disclosure. So the idea is you start, there's an identification of an active exploit in the wild, then you have to determine, is the vulnerability present in your environment? And once you do that, you have to find out, can I patch? If a patch is available, great, but how often is a patch going to be available for a zero-day exploit? Not very often right away. So usually there's a waiting game where you have to take some kind of containment steps in order to minimize your risk. And the clock is ticking. According to a recent article, hackers start to scan for vulnerabilities within 15 minutes of a public disclosure. And there's cases like Log4j where you're behind even before it gets announced. In the case of Log4j, they actually they started exploiting it a day before the public announcement. And we saw something very similar in the case of Microsoft Exchange as well. So quick summary of Log4j, of course, it was an error logging service that was very widely used. Many vendors built it into their platforms. I love this headline, the internet is on fire, because leveraging this vulnerability, the attackers had access to remote code execution, execute arbitrary commands, potentially worm their way into your systems, pivot, and move laterally. So really scary vulnerability, especially because we all had to scramble and figure out what products were impacted. And here's a chart that CrowdStrike put out. You can see in this chart that, number one, there was a weaponized exploit available 1 day before the vulnerability was actually announced. So there's literally no way you can start containing that damage. And that gets to another big underlying point of this presentation. We need to assume vulnerability in all of our systems. That's just where we are. That's life. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are here because you're already doing this. We also see quick integration into standard exploit kits. So not long after Log4j came out, it was in standard hacker toolkits. The Conti ransomware gang was leveraging it for Log4Shell. Our pen test team, hi Tom, Tom runs our team, has been leveraging it too ever since. So hackers on both sides. So we need to contain the damage, often with very little information, conflicting information. When you can, sometimes it's easiest just to take the system down. But again, think about this happening Saturday at 9 o'clock at night. Are your first-line responders authorized to make a decision like that, especially if it may be customer-facing or impact your business? In the case of MoveIt, one of the first containment steps is restrict 443 and 80, right? So, okay, we're just gonna take that web server down. Or we're gonna restrict access to the web server, which could have some operational impacts, but might be the quickest way to stop the bleeding. We've seen many examples of cases where there's challenges with containment. Kaseya was a great example of that. Kaseya is remote monitoring and management software, often used by MSPs to remotely administer their customers' networks. And the remediation that Kaseya came out with, was to immediately shut down your VSA server until you receive virtual notice. And there was a great headline that said, it's basically like turn off your heart. This kills the ability of these MSPs to remotely manage the systems that belong to their customers. They're supposed to turn off the systems that actually give them the access to take care of their customers. And so that was a huge challenge, especially when they have maybe hundreds of customers that are impacted. Another big learning, and by the way, if you guys have any questions, feel free to shout out. It's always fun to have a little interaction. And I have these little cyber slap bracelets too that you can get as a prize if you ask a good question. Another big point that I took away from the MoveIt attacks is that hackers are targeting file sharing services. We have been watching how they're finding these vulnerabilities and searching for them for years now. So one example was Excellion. Back in 2021, Excellion was another secure file sharing appliance. And all of a sudden, customers were notified that there is a 0-day vulnerability out there. This is just one of many examples. Flagstar Bank, this was an early example of a bank that announced that they were hacked because this file transfer appliance had been hacked. So the criminals broke in, they stole that sensitive information, they attempted to extort the bank, they ended up dumping some employee information as part of their threat process. This was tied to Clop, by the way, so we'll see that there's a trend here. Here's interesting animations. This is just a small listing, a subset of the companies that were impacted by the Excellion breach. So Shell, healthcare organizations, universities, security companies, you name it. It was really impactful. And then we move on to the next thing, right? I feel like a month later, everyone's thinking about the next vulnerability. Earlier this year, however, the same gang, the Clop ransomware gang, had been sitting on a 0-day exploit for the Go Anywhere secure file transfer product. 135 victims announced that they had been hacked back in February, and there was some more to follow. This was a 0-day vulnerability in an admin interface. And how many of you think we need to have admin interfaces on the internet? There are some, thanks Tom, you're like, I'm a pen tester, I want them out there. There's some very simple, low-tech ways that we can prevent ourselves from being vulnerable to these issues. So this, again, this was a simple one. It was also perpetrated by Clop. So what do we need to do in these cases? Here, the big risk is a data breach, right? So the big concern for all the companies that were impacted was that they were handling sensitive information, typically on behalf of third parties or maybe their employees, and they would then have to go through the process of notification. Once you announce these things, you often get sued. Breaches are very, very expensive. So right away, when you find out there's a 0-day vulnerability, you need to be thinking about evidence preservation, because you may be hacked and not even realize it. And then if you've been hacked, you want to be able to rule out a breach. You want to be able to say, oh, nobody's information was touched. If you start making changes to the system without preserving evidence, you may lose your ability to rule out a breach later. Data breaches are super expensive. Here's some stats from the IBM cost of a breach report. Worldwide, the average cost of a breach is $4.45 million. How many of you are based here in the United States? Now I'm just trying to get you to exercise. Come on, you guys. In the United States, our cost of a breach is more than double that. On average this year, it was $9.48 million. I think partly because we're fairly litigious and we have a lot of laws surrounding breach notification, things like that. So very important to preserve evidence. All right, here's my trivia for you, for a book. When was the first data breach? When did the term, not the very first data breach, but when did the term data breach first come into popular use? What year? Any guesses? 03, close. What was that? 2000, a little early. 2002. 2002, still early. 5. Who said 5? Nice work. You already got a book. Oh, this is a different book. Yeah, 2005. So it was actually the ChoicePoint data breach. ChoicePoint, come on up afterwards. ChoicePoint was a data broker, one of the top data brokers in the country, and there was a Nigerian identity theft ring that was faxing in fake applications pretending that they were a business. This was huge. The ChoicePoint data breach actually led to all of the state breach notification laws that we see today. By the end of 2005, 22 states had enacted breach notification laws because of ChoicePoint. And then in about, I think it was 2018, when the last of the states in the US enacted a law that was based on those original laws. So if it feels like those state notification laws are a little behind the times, it's because they started from an event that happened in 2005, and now we're kind of bolting on other issues like biometrics. This is the first article I found that referred to a data breach. It was Senator Dianne Feinstein. She said, data breaches are becoming all too common, and current federal law does not require notification to consumers. So at the time, the only reason we found out about ChoicePoint was because the California authorities got involved. They required notification. ChoicePoint only notified California residents, and then they got sued by a coalition of attorney generals in 49 other states and Puerto Rico. So anyway, very impactful. The MoveIt breach also teaches us about the risks that stem from suppliers. Flagstar Bank, in fact, just announced another breach, and from what I can tell, they did not leap to the MoveIt platform. It was because they had a vendor, Fiserv, that was doing processing on their behalf, and Fiserv was using the MoveIt product. So unfortunately, that trickled down to them. Another example was PwC. PwC, of course, is used by many businesses. I've had some clients impacted by this. They were holding files and transferring files on behalf of their customers, and their MoveIt instances were hacked. One thing to note here is that it creates delays. So one of the reasons we're seeing longer and longer notification times is because these are working their way through the supply chain. So you look at that Flagstar Bank notification, that came out in October. October 10th, we found out that Flagstar Bank was hacked. This is for an event that happened in late May, and it was because first their supplier had to do an investigation and notify them, and then they had to do their own investigation. So it gets expensive. When the hackers dumped, they leaked PwC's data, they did so on the clear web. They made it so that it can actually be indexed by Google. It's not on the dark web, and that's especially damaging for people who are data subjects. The more data you're storing, the higher the damage is when it leaks. And remember, we're up to over 60 million impacted individuals. Think about the data you have in file transfer systems right now. When you're transferring a file to somebody, how long do you need it to be up there? Typically less than a day, certainly less than a week. And in many of these cases, there was no retention time set, and so those files were just sitting up there for weeks, for months, for years. We are data hoarders. And security product companies love to sell fancy products, bells and whistles that are very expensive. And they definitely help, in most cases, to identify hackers in your environment. But the fastest and cheapest way to reduce your risk of a breach is to reduce your data. That is like the number one thing I'm taking away from the MoveIt hacks and all these other secure file transfer hacks. So store less, delete more. Make sure across the board you've set automatic retention times so files will be automatically deleted. How many of you feel nervous about having files automatically deleted? Come on, admit it, right? Okay, guys, this is like group therapy. We need to just let it go. We need to let it go. There's other copies. You don't really need it anyway. It's not life or death. Think of data as hazardous waste or like nuclear material. It's very powerful. It's also very risky to have it. The other thing is you're paying more for IT storage when you store too much data or when you're storing data that you don't need. So you also have some other benefits in your budget if you're getting rid of data. In order to do all of this, you need to do the sexiest thing in security, which is maintain an accurate data and asset inventory. Again, I know it's not like the fancy bells and whistles, but this is the foundation of your cybersecurity program. If you don't know exactly what data and assets you have, how can you secure it? And when you're scrambling because a zero-day vulnerability has been announced, you need to know what software you're running. So this is fundamental both for prevention and for response. All right, so let's get back to our vulnerability response playbook. Sooner or later, vendors come up with patches. We're scrambling, we're containing the damage. They will come out with a patch, hopefully. And here's some examples of MoveIt. There was one patch, apply the patch, then there's a second patch, then there's a third patch, and actually in October, just a couple weeks ago, there was another patch for another vulnerability. So again, it's not that you have to check once for a patch. You have to be monitoring regularly because they're going to be putting out new patches. And each of those patches can also give hackers more information about the vulnerabilities that exist in unpatched systems. So you need to have conversations internally so that you know when you can apply emergency patches and software updates. Are you going to authorize that person Saturday night at midnight to apply a patch to Exchange? Or are you worried that something might break and you want it to be tested? And that's the pickle we find ourselves in where, oh man, back in the day we used to have a whole testing process and we can't really do that when it comes to zero-day vulnerabilities. In fact, even the vendors don't have enough time to test their patches. In the case of Kaseya, they put a patch out and then they kind of retracted it and they delayed it because it was having some unintended consequences. So expect multiple updates. The case of Rackspace really illustrates the risks that come from either side of things. So many times IT staff are hesitant to apply an emergency patch, rightfully so, because it might break something. But then if you don't apply a patch, you risk getting hacked. And that's exactly what happened with Rackspace. In December, Rackspace announced, well, they didn't announce, they were hit with a ransomware attack on their hosted Exchange environment. So they were hosting Exchange on behalf of their customers. It was out for, I think it was definitely over a week. I think it was actually closer to 2 weeks. And here you can see the subheading says, and still no word on when hosted Exchange will return. It never returned. The criminals locked up the Exchange environment and they never started offering this again. They actually just switched to the cloud environment and Office 365, managed Office 365. Rackspace said it was a zero-day attack, but it wasn't really a zero-day attack. What happened was that Microsoft disclosed the vulnerability, said it was a privilege escalation, and they did not prioritize it the same way they would have if they thought it was more critical. So this was Rackspace evaluating and determining the risk and deciding it wasn't so risky that they needed to apply a patch right away. And as a result, their customers got hacked because of it. That's the risk of third-party hosted software. So now we have a zero-day vulnerability in really what's a fourth-party supplier because it's being hosted by your third-party supplier. So your third-party supplier is handling the config, ideally handling all that headache for you, but you have to trust their decisions. You have to trust them to make decisions that align with yours when it comes to patch management, when to patch, when not to patch, when to take that risk. And then also you have the question of when are logs going to be available after the fact. I wish we had time to get into the Blackbaud case. For those of you that are interested, drop me a line. That's another cloud hacking case. But often in situations like this, it's, the vendor is dealing with so many different impacted customers, they really do not have time to get back to them with the information they need to understand what was impacted. Another issue that comes up is that vendors may not know that they are vulnerable. So I'll share this case with you that we handled at LMG. We got a call from a financial advisory firm. They were using a security product called MoveIt. This was about 2 weeks after the Log4j attack was announced, and they had received a notification from their vendor that MoveIt was impacted. Now remember, Log4j was getting exploited the day before we even knew there was a vulnerability. And so by the time 2 weeks has gone by, decent chance that you've already been hacked. And that was the case here. So they notified customers 2 weeks later. The big questions that this financial advisory firm wanted to answer was, number one, is our system hacked? Spoiler alert, yes, their servers were hacked. And second, what did the adversary get? Did they steal any sensitive information? Were they able to pivot further into the network? So we did the investigation, and thanks, Matt. Matt headed this up, so appreciate your work on this. And we ended up finding 2 different botnets. One was the Mushtick botnet, that's cryptojacking malware, so can impact operations, but unlikely to impact the confidentiality of your data. And then we found the Mirai botnet, a DDoS botnet. This was not surprising because we often find in cases like this that multiple adversaries have been in the system. In fact, based on the Mandiant M-Trends report last year, in about 27% of the cases that Mandiant saw, there were multiple adversaries in there. So once a system is vulnerable, expect more than one hacking group to get in, and sometimes they're just getting a foothold on your systems, and they're going to do more later. They're going to sell access to other people. Another issue that makes it hard to understand your risk is that once a vendor announces their product is vulnerable, the race is on. Attackers are going to start targeting that product. And that's what happened with Zytel in the Log4j case. As soon as Zytel announced that they were vulnerable to Log4j, all of a sudden, hackers started to integrate that product, that exploit, into their systems and target the Zytel products. Okay, so I'll quickly summarize how this ended. We did a full forensic analysis of the mobile iron servers. The good news was they got very lucky. There was no lateral movement. They didn't have any evidence of data theft, but they had to hire a forensics firm. They had to do an investigation. They had to fully rebuild the mobile iron server, and who's going to cover those costs? Is it the software vendor? Unlikely. Is it anybody else in the supply chain? Unlikely. You end up bearing those costs. That's where cyber insurance can be really helpful, by the way. If anyone wants to talk cyber insurance later, come find me. I think it's just fascinating. Okay, so it's really important to proactively check with your suppliers. Every time a zero-day vulnerability is announced, I recommend to my clients that they just send a written email to each of their priority suppliers. You may not be able to get all of them, but your key suppliers, and you just ask, were you running an affected version of this product? If so, how did you handle it? Were we impacted, etc.? So you want to give them a deadline. You want to make sure you actually get a response so that you can understand what your risk is and not find out after the fact. And again, unfortunately, your vendors, your suppliers, are probably still figuring out if they're impacted. It also can change over time, so you probably want to have a contractual clause that requires them to report to you after a certain amount of time. All right, any questions so far on the material we've covered? Great. One thing that's really going to help us as an industry is increasing use of SBOMs, software bills of material. So that's basically your list of ingredients for your software. This is something that the US government has been pushing for the past year or two, and we're starting to see more and more commercial products that make it easy to generate these. So here's a few examples: Sonatype, Sift, MergeBase. Microsoft has an open source tool. Here's one that we ran in the lab on malware. So you can see exactly what packages the malware is using. That was kind of fun. And create your SBOM for the malware that you find. All right, so let's talk about the Cisco zero-day attack. We've kind of come full circle now. What can we learn from the Cisco zero-day that's going on right now? So to give you the timeline, on October 16th, Cisco announced a critical vulnerability. And this vulnerability allows attackers to run level 15 administrator commands remotely on the system. This is a CVSS 10 criticality, the highest criticality you can get. Once they run those commands, they have the ability to create a new local user. And this user will have normal privileges, but that enables the hackers to log in using the web UI to the system, to the device that they're on. Once they're logged in, Cisco announced 4 days later that there was a second vulnerability. So again, expect things to evolve. You may hear about one vulnerability, expect to hear a second, a third, maybe even a fourth in some cases. So on October 20th, Cisco announced that second vulnerability, and that's essentially a privilege escalation. It allows them to escape from iOS and gain access to the underlying Linux operating system. And at that point, they're able to execute arbitrary commands and install a persistent backdoor on the operating system on that device, so that even if you get rid of the users that you've created, they still have that backdoor in the system. So that's a summary of what we know of the Cisco attack to date. You can scan for devices with the vulnerable version. As of last night, there were 150,000 known vulnerable Cisco versions out there. And you can also scan and look for that backdoor. So again, there was a news article indicating that a researcher had found 40,000. I'm going to show you some examples of how these indicators are evolving, though. So again, another part of your zero-day response checklist is to look for indicators indicators of compromise. You know that you're running a product that's impacted. You know that you're running a version that's affected. Or even if you're not, that may evolve. Check for indicators of compromise. See if there's a chance that the attackers may have already gained a foothold on your system. One thing that I have seen lead to ransomware and other issues is that many times people patch the vulnerability and think they're done. And the problem is, if you patch and the attackers have already installed that backdoor, it doesn't matter. They're already in your system. So you've got to check for those IOCs. Everyone know what I mean by indicators of compromise? Evidence that your system may have been hacked. The problem is, where do you get your indicators of compromise? Sometimes there's too few, sometimes there's too many, sometimes they're just not right. We've seen cases, and Microsoft Exchange is a great example of this, where so many different customers of Microsoft were hacked, they started putting out different indicators of compromise. Hey, our server was hacked, these are suspicious IP addresses, things like that. And those were not necessarily, those might have been specific to their situation, but they were not necessarily accurate indicators. So that's a problem. Figure out where you're going to get your indicators, whether it's the vendor, government agencies, colleagues, or researchers, and stick with that. These indicators not just can, but they will change over time. So what you're looking at is how the number of hacked Cisco devices has been tracked over time. And you can see at first that researchers were tracking 30,000, that went up to about 40,000, and all of a sudden, we see here, boom, it goes to nothing. Nothing. No Cisco devices were impacted. Okay. So what happened was the attackers updated their malware, and they removed the indicators that researchers had been looking for. I have to tell you, when I first saw that, I thought, ooh, did the systems get cleaned? Because what happened in the Microsoft Exchange case was that the FBI got authorization to just proactively go and clean up all of the affected systems. So that's one possibility. Maybe law enforcement just cleaned these up for us. Another possibility, Matt and I were talking earlier about the BrickerBot malware. This was malware that leveraged the same vulnerabilities as the Mirai botnet, but instead it would just brick those devices. So they just weren't online anymore. They were gone. So a little bit devastating. So in this case, the attackers updated their malware. So what you should see, or what we were seeing, was that you would look for that backdoor and it would return a 404, which in this case would indicate that you were impacted. And the hackers changed that so that the indicator was not correct anymore. And then at that point, eventually the defenders ended up finding a different way to identify hacked devices, and then all of a sudden you see those hacked devices getting tracked again. So expect to see this change. The attackers appear to be actively updating their malware so that it gets more stealthy, and then defenders are responding. It'll be kind of interesting to see how we track hacked devices over the next few weeks and months. All right, once you have a device that you think may have been hacked, it's really important to assume that hackers are still in your systems. This is just a little candy for the presentation, but here's an example where the Black Hat ransomware gang attacked Western Digital, and they started joining the incident response team's Zoom meetings and monitoring them, and then taking screenshots of their Zoom meetings and labeling them on the dark web, an early morning session, and putting that out there. Here's another example where the criminals were watching this victim's communications, and they were taking screenshots of the responders' emails and chats and posting them to the dark web. So again, the hackers, they're not always this obvious. Sometimes it's much more subtle, although a lot of times they do seem tempted to like jump in and say, we're watching your email, that report was wrong, things like that. Really important to hunt for threats. This is an example of, so this is again the last piece of our checklist. So this was a case, I'm showing you the CrowdStrike interface. We're hunting for threats, and in this case, it all started with an infected Word document, which was used to launch PowerShell, which was then used to run commands and go forward from there. So threat hunting can often show you where the source of the issue was so that you can actually eradicate it. Now, again, we talked about the importance of reducing your data for reducing your risk. Again, biggest takeaway from this presentation is assume that you're hacked, assume that you are vulnerable. So we want to be reducing our data. We also want to be minimizing our attack surface, and the Cisco zero-day exploit is a great example of this, where it's a vulnerability in the web UI. Cisco and CISA both came out with the same recommendation where you can disable the web server. You can just disable the web UI, or if you don't want to do that, at least restrict it to trusted networks. I've been a penetration tester for 15 years, and I think people thought I was crazy in 2008 because I would mark RDP and I would mark any other web logins, especially for firewalls and other perimeter devices, and say, hey, high risk, get them off the internet, they don't have to be there. And that's really what we need to be doing, just minimizing your attack surface, because you are not going to know about a zero-day vulnerability after it happened, or before it happens. Also, this is a great chart from Microsoft that shows you how long it takes for zero-day vulnerabilities to eventually get incorporated into scanning tools. So from the time a vulnerability is publicly disclosed and a patch is released to the time that it will actually show up in common vulnerability scanning tools is 4 months, 120 days. And that means when you're doing vulnerability scanning, know that it's not going to catch everything. I use them first and foremost to understand what my attack surface is, and if it comes up with vulnerabilities, great, but we really need to be thinking critically and, again, focusing on minimization. That's also why penetration testing is still relevant and important today, because these automated scans are not finding everything. They're not finding authentication bypass, sometimes sensitive data that's out there. They're not finding zero-day vulnerabilities that sometimes the human brain can find. Speaking of which, I'll end on this note. I got a call from Tom, our head of penetration testing yesterday, and he said, we just found a zero-day vulnerability in a product, and this may have much bigger ramifications. So it turned out that Emily Gosney on our team, hello Emily if you're watching, she found a zero-day vulnerability. She was doing a penetration test of a credit union's web page that has a member login. So this is a highly sensitive product. It's something that if attackers were able to get into it, they could potentially scrape banking credentials, things like that. So definitely a targeted type of application. She found a critical vulnerability, and she was able to dump the user tables and crack the admin passwords within 45 seconds. And upon further research, we found that this was not a product, this vulnerability did not just impact our one client, it would impact all customers of the same application, some of which were fairly high profile. So big props to Emily for finding that, but I immediately thought, wow, this really ties in with this presentation, because I can tell you from experience with our team that vendors are not going to be able to patch this immediately. And the other customers right now do not know about this zero-day vulnerability because it takes time. It's a process. And as we've seen time and time again, it may take months or even years for the vendor to fix a vulnerability, and they're probably not going to tell you about it until they have a way to patch it because they don't want criminals to start exploiting it. So hackers are going to quietly use those zero-day vulnerabilities and hoard them until they get outed. In cases like MoveIt, the attackers are announcing that, but there are so many other cases where the attackers are not committing extortion and they're not announcing it, and those zero-day vulnerabilities are lingering. So I know our pen test team, once they find a zero-day, they're going to be seeing that in networks. Every time they see a client with that product, they're going to know they can immediately take over. And the real hackers, well, not you guys are real hackers, the bad guys are doing the same thing. And by the way, if you're curious to learn more, Tom is doing a talk tomorrow on how I met your printer at the Education and Community track at 3:30. I'm excited about that. Can't wait to watch it. Okay, so where does that leave us? Number one, we need to update our incident response plans. Make sure you are integrating zero-day exploits into your incident response documentation. If you don't have a playbook for that, check out CISA's. They have a really great walkthrough. It's a great resource. Again, drop me a line on LinkedIn if you need a link to that or a reference, and I'm happy to send you a copy of these slides. And then it's all well and good to have an actual manual or a playbook, but it's not real until your team actually practices it. According to IBM, having an up-to-date incident response plan and testing it regularly can save you, on average, $2.6 million in the event of a breach. So there's real cost savings that comes from having an updated and accurate plan. And then here's your checklist for zero-day exploit response. Make sure you're monitoring for threat intelligence. You determine if you're affected, not always simple. Check your key suppliers. Do not forget to proactively reach out and require them to get back to you. You want to build that into your contracts ahead of time. Make sure you are preserving evidence. Assume that any attack could be a breach, and the sooner you start preserving evidence, the better off you will be in the long run. Contain the damage. Take steps to minimize your risk because attackers may be exploiting this very quickly. Search for indicators of compromise. Don't assume you can patch and then you're done. Make sure you check and make sure that you've been impacted. Once patches are out, apply the patches and updates, but expect that there will probably be multiple. And finally, hunt for threats. Make sure you've fully eradicated those attackers. And with that, I think we are right on time, and we have a few minutes for questions. Or comments. Stories. Yes?
Have a book?
Yes. I have one extra one, so come up to me afterwards, and I will give you one. Good question. Anything else? Yes?
So when it came to vulnerability scanning, is there an article out there that knows like the mean time between passive and constant tools of finding zero-day exploits?
I couldn't quite catch what you were saying. Is there a, what was that?
So a passive reconnaissance tool that scans like vendors, public facing IT assets. Is there like an article out there or evidence that suggests like how long it takes these tools to find?
So you're talking about, is there a tool that will scan your suppliers to see if they have vulnerabilities?
There are. I'm just saying, do you know like if there is like data on how this I'm trying to think.
So the question is on how long it takes for those to be detectable?
Yeah, to be detectable.
I don't know that offhand, but I bet someone on our team does, so drop me a line after this and I can get you that answer.
Yeah, that would be useful.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, thank you guys so much. Looking forward to seeing you around.